Hello chess friends. In this video I will be reviewing the recent game from round 2 of the Qatar Masters tournament in which Magnus Carlsen was mercilessly crushed by a grandmaster named Soleimanov who was rated over 300 points lower than him. After the game, Carlsen, in what is becoming a pattern, attempted to excuse his loss via Twitter, not by implying that his opponent was cheating, as he did in the past with Hans Niemann, but instead by first congratulating his opponent for a well-played game, but then also lamenting the fact that his opponent was allowed to wear a watch during the game, something Carlsen had mentioned to the arbiter at the time, who had told him that traditional watches were allowed to be worn by players in the tournament. Carlsen claimed that since the watch could potentially be used as a cheating device, the fact that his opponent was allowed to wear one was such a distraction that he could not play at his usual level, hence losing the game. This recent tendency of Carlsen's to make excuses every time he loses to opponents that he feels he should have beat is reminiscent of another famous chess player from the past. That is the great Bobby Fischer, who was known to be very finicky about playing conditions, especially when he wasn't playing well. When Boris Spassky defeated Fischer in Game 1 of the 1972 World Championship, Bobby Fischer blamed the noisy tournament hall for his bad play and demanded that the television cameras be removed because he found them distracting. When his request was denied, Fischer refused to play Game 2 of the match, which he then lost by forfeit. Now, I will pose a question to the viewer. Do you think this is reasonable behavior? Should a top-level player, or any chess player, be making excuses when they lose games that they think they should have won? I am going to tell you my thoughts on the matter, but first, I want to go through this incredible game in which Carlsen was absolutely dominated to the point where he felt compelled to take to Twitter yet again to offer an explanation for why things went so terribly wrong for him in this fateful encounter. So without any further ado, here's the game. Soleimanov has the white pieces and begins the game with d4. Magnus Carlsen responds knight to f6. We have c4, e6, knight to f3, and b6 from Magnus Carlsen, looking to develop his bishop along this diagonal. a3 from Soleimanov prevents any bishop to b4 check, which is often a useful move for black in this opening. It also supports b4. And now Carlsen decides that he wants to play for the move c5. He wants to trade off this less central c-pawn for white's central d-pawn. And the way he makes this happen is he plays bishop to a6, first attacking c4. Now let's look at if you were to just play bishop to b7, white played knight c3, and then you went c5. Well, here white could push to d5. This pawn has adequate protection. This isn't what you want as black. You want white to have to leave his pawn there, and then you trade off your c-pawn for the d-pawn. So the way we do this is Magnus Carlsen's move bishop to a6. We're attacking the pawn. Now, how does white defend? There's not a great way to do that. You could play e3, defending with the bishop, but then you've blocked your dark squared bishop's development along this diagonal, and you also want to play that pawn to e4 at some point and get a nice big center. You could also defend with knight to d2, again blocking this bishop, or you could play what Soleimanov played in the game, queen to c2. But now after Carlsen's bishop to b7, you can see this queen here is no longer influencing the d5 square as she would be if she was still on d1. So that's what black has accomplished with this maneuver, so that after knight c3 and c5, d5 is no longer possible for white as it would just lose a pawn. Black has too many pieces attacking that square. It would be okay if the queen was still here on d1 to support. So that's how black has benefited by drawing the queen off of that d file. We have e4 though from Soleimanov. Now that the queen's here, she can support that e pawn. We have c takes d4, knight takes d4, bishop c5 from Carlsen, attacking this knight with tempo. Now a traditionally popular move here for white is to drop the knight back to b3, hitting the bishop. But Soleimanov decides to go for knight to f3. The knight's a little more central right here, hitting more central squares, and the bishop can be kicked with b4. That's what's coming in a minute. So after knight c6, we have b4, the bishop drops back to e7, and bishop b2. Now at this point, white is going to want to play rook to d1, e5, knight e4, and knight to d6 if possible. Of course, Carlsen's going to try to stop that. And the way he begins to play against that is he moves his queen to b8. He wants to play d6 to discourage the move e5. Now, if you didn't play that queen move, if you, let's say, just castled and then rook to d1 comes and you try to play d6 here to stop e5, well, e5's coming anyway because this pawn is pinned to the queen. You can't take or you're losing your queen. So that's why Carlsen chooses to get his queen off of that file where he knows the rook is coming. It actually comes on the next move with rook to d1. He castles. Now we have bishop to e2. This shields the king, so that e5 is going to become a threat. Let's say if here Carlsen played rook to c8, you could play e5 because if knight takes e5, knight takes, queen takes, you got knight to d5. Because this bishop had shielded the king, this queen move didn't come with check on the king. And so now white can play this move with the discovery on the queen. The queen goes here. And then, because you had to defend the bishop, but then you got knight to f6 check, winning the queen. So that's just a little sample variation, which shows why Magnus Carlsen at this point played d6. Doesn't want e5 to come. So next we have castles by Suleimanov. Rook to c8, okay, that's a nice move. It's always good to put your rook opposite your opponent's queen, even if there's a lot of pieces in the way. There could be some tactic at some point, and maybe Carlsen can target the c4 pawn in some way. All right, rook f to e1 from Suleimanov. He is anticipating that this rook is going to be useful here, defending e4, and he is not wrong. Now, bishop to f8 from Carlsen. This clears the way for the knight to e7 maneuver, which is going to open up the diagonal for the bishop. Now the engine prefers, instead of this bishop move, it likes the move knight to e5 here. Even though it allows knight takes e5, d takes e5, black has the doubled pawns. White can't really win this pawn on e5 or anything, it's defended by the queen. And now the bishop has an open diagonal. You can target this pawn, you can maybe play a5, put some pressure on that b4 point. So that's what the engine likes. But Carlsen's idea isn't too bad. Bishop to f8, he hasn't really messed anything up yet. Bishop to f1 from Suleimanov, that's a good move because now after knight to e7, this move, bishop f1, enables him to play a very nice and very strong move right here. If you haven't seen this game, see if you can find white's strongest move in this position. Suleimanov uncorks knight to b5, attacking d6, and there's not a lot of good ways to defend that pawn. Let's look at a couple options here. If you were to play rook d8, looks kind of reasonable. Knight takes d6 can be played anyway because after rook takes d6, rook takes, queen takes, we got e5 with a fork. White's getting the piece back, and then taking on f6 is going to disrupt the pawn structure around the black king. This is not good for black. So what else? You have d5, looks reasonable until you realize that bishop to e5 is a big problem. This queen has nowhere to go. If you want to save your queen, you're going to have to do something like rook c7 and lose your rook. So that's not working. What's the best defense then? Well, the computer likes knight to g6. Okay, now the pawn's protected by the bishop. This, of course, allows bishop takes f6, g takes f6. You've weakened the area around the black king a little bit. But this is playable for black. It favors white, according to Stockfish, but it's not over or anything. But after what Carlsen plays, which looks reasonable on the surface, knight to e8, Suleimanov finds another incredibly strong move. What do you think he played at this point? What is white's strongest move here? Suleimanov now plays knight to g5. The threat is e5, attacking d6 further while uncovering a discovered checkmating threat on h7. Has to be dealt with. Carlsen went for knight to g6, blocking the potential for checkmate on h7, eyeing e5, but that knight is not really protecting e5, so e5 is played anyway by Suleimanov. That knight can no longer move. If that knight goes anywhere, checkmate is coming. And again, you can't take the pawn on e5, or bishop takes e5, causes a bit of a problem for the queen, which has no squares. So what Carlsen does is he plays d5, attacking the c4 pawn, which is pinned to Suleimanov's queen. So he plays queen to b3. And you might think the whole point of this move is to unpin the pawn, but more significantly, he wants to move that queen to h3, and again threaten checkmate. So Carlsen decides this knight has to go. He plays bishop to e7. But now, Suleimanov sacks the knight on f7. and after king takes f7, takes on d5. Carlsen responds, bishop takes d5. You could also take with the pawn, but that would most likely just transpose into what happened in the game, which involved further exchanges on d5 with rook takes d5, e takes d5, queen takes d5 check, king to f8. This is the only move. And at this point, white is a rook down and only has 2 pawns to show for it. But after knight to d4, things are getting very serious. The knight wants to drop into e6 with check, which is going to be devastating. You don't want that knight to land there. And black has a couple ways to prevent it. First, I want to show you this really cool line with knight to c7. Almost looks reasonable because it attacks the queen and it watches over this square. But here, you have a beautiful sequence. Queen to f3 check, king to g8, knight to c6, hitting the queen. Again, taking advantage of the fact that this queen is chronically short on squares. It can only go to b7, after which knight takes e7 check, wins the queen. So that move, knight c7, is out. What Carlsen decides to do is knight to f4 with an attack on the queen. Maybe he realized that after what Suleimanov played, queen to f3, he was going to lose this knight because it's now pinned to the king. There's no way to save it. If you play g5, we're just going to play g3. But maybe he thought he could survive after just king g8, getting his king off of that open file. Queen takes f4. Because here the material is equalized if you count up the value of the pieces. But unfortunately for Carlsen, he's still hopelessly lost. He plays queen to b7. He realizes that knight f5 is probably coming. This bishop will need protection and maybe some lateral defense along this way. We got the bishop bearing down. But after knight f5, the threats are too great. The most obvious one being bishop to a6 if it were white to move, threatening to win the exchange when the queen moves, and you cannot take that bishop with the queen or else there will be knight takes e7 check, king goes here, and that's going to be a checkmate. Also a problem here for black is bishop to c4 check, and we're going to see what that does in a minute. Carlsen attempts to stop both of these ideas with his move b5. Okay, there's no more bishop a6, there's no bishop c4, but there is bishop takes b5, because again, if you take that bishop, there's going to be knight takes e7 check, king moves, and then you have checkmate here. So Carlsen, realizing that fact, plays bishop to f8, getting that bishop out of the way. But after bishop c4 check, king h8, and now knight to h6, with a discovered attack on the bishop on f8, threatening checkmate, Carlsen resigns. There is no hope here. Let me show you a couple possible attempts and why they fail. If you move this bishop back to e7, then we have knight f7 check, king g8, knight to d8, discovered check, will win the queen. Let's look at instead what the computer suggested, queen to e7, defending the bishop that way. Now we got knight f7 check, king g8. The simple is just knight d6, discovered check, king goes to h8, and then just grab a rook here. And after rook takes c8, white is up 3 pawns, and the attack on black's king is still raging. Completely hopeless for black. So just an incredible engine-like performance from Suleimanov, who surely must have left Carlsen feeling completely helpless and wondering how he could have been defeated so convincingly in a classical game by an opponent rated so much lower than him. So now I will tell you what I think of Magnus Carlsen's reaction on Twitter. In my opinion, if Magnus Carlsen is not completely satisfied with the playing conditions in any tournament, especially when it comes to the potential for cheating, he should refuse to play rather than finishing the game and then complaining after the fact whenever he loses. If Carlsen had won this game, I guarantee he wouldn't have said anything about it. You wouldn't have heard about his concerns with his opponent's watch, and Carlsen would have forgotten all about it. He is setting himself up to be suspicious when he plays under any circumstances under which he feels cheating could be possible. And this is the problem that's developing in competitive chess. Any player who has a good day and plays brilliantly against a much stronger player is susceptible now to suspicion because of the fact that in the minds of many players, including Carlsen, cheating is believed to be possible in top-level events. So rather than making excuses on Twitter every time he gets dominated by a lower player, Carlsen should be focusing on putting pressure on those running the tournament to step up anti-cheating measures by refusing to play in the first place if they don't. This is the only solution I see to what is going to just become a bigger problem if more top players don't start getting serious about only playing in situations where they feel totally confident that no cheating can or will take place. So those are my thoughts. Please subscribe to the channel for more content like this coming soon, and thanks for watching.